Hello, my name is Dylan Fischer. I'm a forest ecologist and member of the faculty at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Today I'll be presenting on ecosystem and vegetation recovery following the 2015 eruption of Calbuco volcano in Chile. My co-authors on this presentation are Nina Ferrari and Charlie Crisafulli at the U.S. Forest Service and Mount St. Helens Institute. This is a study that was started by Charlie following the 2015 eruption of Calbuco, and I was invited to join the project in 2018 and 19. Tephra deposition is one of the most common and one of the most widespread forms of volcanic disturbance worldwide. Although when we think of volcanic eruptions, the tendency is to think of the destructive impact of eruptions adjacent to volcanic craters, especially in stratovolcanoes. Tephra deposition can actually have a much wider footprint and can have a lasting and important impact on ecosystems. One of the most thoroughly studied examples of tephra fall impacts comes from Mount St. Helens. On May 18th in 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens created a grand opportunity to understand how ecosystems respond to disturbance. For over 40 years, researchers have been studying the recovery of understory vegetation that was smothered by tephra following the eruption, but has slowly crept back to life in forests that retained their tree canopies. Here I'm showing two images from an old-growth forest ecosystem adjacent to Mount St. Helens that saw that dramatic impact of tephra in 1980. The same site is shown in 1980, looking like a black and white photo, and 2013, where it looks like vegetation has largely recovered at the site, and it's hard to tell that this site was impacted by an adjacent volcanic eruption. The data in this graph come from one site that has been thoroughly studied since 1980, with year on the x-axis and percent cover on the y-axis. The different colored dots refer to weather plots were studied that served as controls, where tephra was removed in 1980, serving as an experimental control for the impact of tephra, or whether tephra was left intact. And one really important point that I want to bring out from this figure is notice the difference in shrub percent cover by 2016. The white squares represent tephra impacted plots, and the black squares at the top of the graph show tephra control plots. The growth form of shrubs was severely reduced as a result of the tephra impact. In contrast, bryophytes at the site were not as severely impacted. This was different at different sites. However, growth form plays a large role in determining how ecosystems will respond. These data are community ordinations of the holistic community, plant community profiles at 4 sites adjacent to Mount St. Helens that all receive tephra. The gray dots represent tephra impacted plots, and the black dots represent tephra control plots. In these ordinations, moving from left to right, you can see that at the very top, we had a site that in 1980 didn't have much difference between tephra and control plots and retained that lack of difference through 2016. We would refer to this maybe as resistance to tephra impact. The next row shows a site that had similar communities in 1981 between tephra and control plots, but those plots diverged over time such that by 2016, the communities seemed to be on separate community trajectories, and the community profiles looked different. At the very bottom, we have a site that was impacted by tephra initially. There were large differences in community profile between plots in 1981. However, through time, these plots converged, and we have similar communities in 2016. This is all within the same forest ecosystem type, but we see different patterns of vegetation response to the tephra deposition event. Within tephra systems, within systems that are impacted by tephra, there are several knowledge gaps. Among these are understanding what patterns and different growth forms are at different sites, understanding how community composition might shift through time, and understanding how ecosystem properties such as soil nitrogen and carbon might shift through time. I'm going to address all of these in the talk today. We're going to use the eruption of Calbuco volcano in 2015 as an example. All of our data that we'll present today were collected on the north slope of the volcano at 3 distinct sites at 3 distinct elevations. These sites will be referred to as Deep Scoria 1, Deep Scoria 2, and Deep Scoria 3. At each of these 3 sites, there were 3 large macroplots that were set up. These are 250 meter squared plots where percent cover of all vegetation was recorded within each macroplot. This slide shows a photo point at one of our lowest elevation spots. And you can see that in 2016, the ecosystem was relatively devoid of vegetation, whereas by 2019, the vegetation had recovered so much it was hard to see through the plot. An important point about this particular Tephra deposition event is that the scoria that was deposited in the eruption had a scouring effect on the vegetation. It essentially raked the standing trees, shrubs, and vegetation of green material, and that was largely deposited with the scoria in the new Tephra soil. Because of this, in 2016, there's very little vegetation present, and it's important to understand that that was all as a result of that eruption. Here I'm going to show a panel of graphs separated by growth form, looking at relative percent cover in each stand by year. We're going to focus first on Gramanoid growth forms. In these Valdivian temperate rainforest ecosystems, Gramanoids such as Chuskia, bamboos, Chuskia species, are really important members of the understory plant community. They can form impenetrable thickets that are hard to get through and that dominate the understory, creating low light conditions for virtually every plant. Essentially, these ecosystems get buried by Chuskia growth. In response to the eruption or following the eruption, we saw that at the mid-elevation site, there was a significant increase in Chuskia through time. At the low elevation site, there was an initial jump in Chuskia through time, but not a significant trend through time. At the highest elevation site, we saw no significant trend in Chuskia growth through time. Fast forwarding to herbaceous community members, we saw very little change in herbaceous community members, but when we go to the shrub community members, we see something completely different. Shrub species increased dramatically at the mid-elevation and the high elevation sites. A lot of this increase in relative cover of shrubs was driven by Fuchsia magellanica, shown here in the photo. Shrub percent cover went from near 0 upwards of 20 or 25% at both the mid and high elevation sites. In contrast, trees showed yet a different pattern. At low elevation and mid elevation sites, we saw an increase in tree percent cover. However, at the high elevation site, we saw almost no increase or very small increases in tree percent cover. A lot of this may have to do with the types of trees that are present at these distinct sites. Our sites differ dramatically in the dominance of tree species. At the highest elevation site, Nothofagus dombii dominated these forests, and relatively small diameter representatives of Nothofagus dombii. This graph shows a diameter distribution for each site. And you can see at the very top in red, Nothofagus dombii is represented. At the second elevation site, the mid-elevation site, and our low elevation site, we had species like Dasyphilum dicanthoides and Loraleopsis philippiana that dominated the sites. These species were scoured of green material on their branches and their canopies during the eruption, but resprouted from the boles, forming relatively columnar-looking trees, as you can see from the center photo. These tree canopies may have only been 1 to 2 meters wide, but through time, the recovery of that vegetation resulted in an increase in tree percent cover at each site and represented a large portion of the ecosystem's recovery. Whereas at the high elevation site, trees did not recover and are still standing dead. When we look at the entire community ordination for these sites, looking holistically at the whole plant community, we see some interesting trends. In this graph, we see a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination. In this ordination, the centroids of each site and year are represented by the years on the graph. So for example, at the very top of the graph, 2016, the number 2016 represents the year 2016 for each of our 3 sites. You can see that trends in differences between sites and community change through time appeared to be relatively orthogonal in this ordination space, in this 2-dimensional ordination, such that through time, each site saw a progression of the community from the top of the graph to the lower part of the graph in community footprint, and there were differences between sites that were readily apparent as we read from right to left or left to right. So there was a site effect and there was a year effect, but they did not interact significantly in this ordination. Interestingly, at the high elevation site, you can see that through time, from 2016 to 2019, there's a gradual shift in community composition. At the mid-elevation site, there was a relatively rapid shift between 2016 and 2017 to a community ordination location that looks similar through 2019. And at the low elevation site, there's a pattern that's in between the other 2. When we look at soil properties, we see yet a different pattern altogether, but one that's really consistent with theory in how ecosystems respond to disturbance in terms of their soils, especially forest ecosystems. In these graphs, the 2015 bars represent sampling the soils after the eruption, but by digging down through the tephra and then sampling the old forest soil. So the 2015 is an estimate of what we think the old forest soil looked like in terms of organic matter, percent carbon, and percent nitrogen. In each of these cases, you can see that organic matter, carbon, and nitrogen were much higher in soils before the eruption. Following the eruption, the tephra itself actually had a relatively high amount of organic matter, carbon, and nitrogen. We expect tephra to be devoid of organic matter, carbon, and nitrogen, but because of the scoria that fell on this site that really raked the tree canopies, we had a lot of organic matter that was deposited with the tephra in these soils. What was surprising about these data is to see that decline in percent carbon, nitrogen, and organic matter through time. By 2017, all of our sites had lower carbon, organic matter, and nitrogen. And then that trend continued, and then in some cases is increasing as vegetation is regrowing. This is somewhat analogous to what we see with patterns from chronosequences in clear cuts in other temperate rainforest systems, where there's rapid decomposition of organic material after it's deposited on the forest floor in a massive disturbance event. In these sites, we saw relatively rapid recovery compared to what we've seen in other systems like at Mount St Helens. Mount St Helens, after 40 years, we're still waiting for some major vegetation community members to respond and to recover at many sites that were impacted by tephra. However, at this site, within just 4 years, we saw dramatic increases in shrubs and trees, and in some cases, gramanoids at each site. These patterns differ by growth form, and patterns in carbon, nitrogen, and organic matter are still lagging that vegetation recovery, but in a way that's consistent with theory. I'd like to give special acknowledgement for this talk to Pablo Salman Molina and Barbara Corrales Garcia at Parque Valle Los Olmos. They hosted this work for multiple years and continue to invite researchers to participate in understanding the impact of the eruption. Additionally, multiple volunteers, both in Chile and students and researchers from the United States, have contributed to these data. And so this work really couldn't have been done without everybody on this list. So thank you so much to everybody, and thank you to everybody listening to this talk. That's it for my talk today. Thank you for paying attention. I hope you have a great remote ESA, and welcome any questions. Thank you.